Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Down Syndrome Center podcast. As always, I'm your host, Dr. Kishore Vellody. And as we are now here in the middle of our school years, pretty much for everywhere, we are still thinking about how best to provide education to people with Down syndrome. And we've had a few podcasts up to this point on this topic, but we've never had one of the world's experts on the podcast to talk about this. And so today I'm so excited to have Sue Buckley on with us from London. And we are so excited to have her here on the podcast to share her expertise with all of you. So Sue, thank you so much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for asking me.
Well, of course. And I wonder if you might just start with just letting us know a little bit about who you are, what you do, and what it is that attracts you to working with people with Down syndrome.
Okay. Well, I'm a psychologist and a clinical psychologist by original training, though these things don't exactly translate to the US system. And so I trained in clinical psychology and went to work with people with what we now call people with learning disability in the UK. And so I knew that was the area of work I'd like to go into. In the process, so I went to work in what were the large institutions. And of course, we began slowly to develop services in the community. I mean, when I started out, there wasn't a right for little ones with Down syndrome to even go to school. And then left in one of these institutions was a baby with Down syndrome who came to us as a foster child and stayed. So that kind of focused my interest in much more closely on development of youngsters with Down syndrome. And so I continued to work developing community services, but also in an academic job in a university, which gave me the opportunity to do research.
That's wonderful. And your organization, Down Syndrome Educational International, it is really known throughout the world. So the title is so appropriate. Can you tell our audience a little bit about what it is? What is DSEI? What do you guys do?
Okay, well, our main focus is to promote the development and education of youngsters with Down syndrome. And it's grown from a small organisation that was local. And there are two strands, really. As soon as I started to focus in on early intervention, I realised we didn't actually know how having this extra chromosome alters development. So our interventions were just treating children as if they were a delayed version of typical development, which they're not. So this strand of doing research, so we could learn more about why development might be delayed, and translating that into practice has always been our drive. So the charity has funded and carried out research, but always with the intention of it being delivered in services. And until recently, we ran direct services. Now it's all online, training courses and so on, and teaching materials. So the focus is sharing evidence-based practice. That's keeping wonderful. On top of what the research tells us around the world. There is not enough research for the little ones with Down syndrome, or the older ones. But what there is, our starting point is always to understand more about typical development, because once we see the factors that influence typical development for developing speech or language or reading, we can then look and see how that might change when the youngster has Down syndrome and identify which factors are altered, which means we can be much more effective in interventions.
And I love the focus on the evidence-based. And of course, just like we always say, even in the medical side of things, there's just not enough information out there for people with Down syndrome. So I appreciate your heart for finding evidence-based within education as well. I guess as we kind of go into more of the specifics of some of the areas that you and your organization have focused on, one part that I know is in terms of developing clearer speech skills for somebody with Down syndrome and how important that is. Can you expand a little bit about what you have found and how you approach that topic?
Okay, so I've always had a focus on speech and language development on the principle that learning to communicate is the most important thing a baby does.
Yes.
And they learn nearly everything else. They learn what objects do because we name them and describe them and so on. So developing an understanding of language and then being able to use it to communicate is central. And it's interesting you ask about speech clarity first, because most young people with Down syndrome do not achieve the clarity that you and I and most adults take for granted. Their speech is not clear. Now, we don't know enough about that. So again, our approach to this is based on typical development, that in the first year of life, babies are tuning to the language they hear. And at a few weeks of age, they can discriminate the sounds in any language anybody's tried. But by 9, 10 months of age, they're not so good now at the language they haven't been hearing around them, but are much better at discriminating sounds in the language they need for talking. And of course, for understanding words, the difference between hat, cat, mat is only a single consonant. So our approach to this is to work at what we think matters for typical development. So to make sure the babies are listening and hearing and discriminating speech sounds, particularly because we have fluctuating hearing loss, but also following what bit of research there is out there. People like Barbara Dodd, who have run early intervention studies, dated now, but we have very little hard evidence about what's effective. So what we focus on is training up what we think typically developing children are building step by step.
And what would be the approach to help with that clarity? Is there a specific approach that you would talk about, or is there somewhere where families might be able to get help in that field as we go through that early developmental stage?
Okay, well, there's probably two messages there. One of the issues, obviously, is to be able to hear and imitate speech sounds, and then a huge amount of practice. Yeah. So we have a very simple, can we hear and produce sounds? Can we babble? And then when we start to produce word-like words, can we work at improving that? So one word that I have across all areas of development is practice, practice, practice. Mm-hmm. The typical youngster, the minute they begin to manage something like dropping something and seeing what happens to it, or getting up on their feet, they practice, practice, practice without any prompting from other people. And that automatizes skills. And our youngsters are going to struggle to do that. So you start off with some difficulties, and then they get worse because the natural practice that would be going on to get a child to the next stage in typical development isn't happening. So that's a slightly long-winded version. And as a result, we've developed a See and Learn speech program of materials. We ran an early intervention service for some 20 years, and we tried all these things in that intervention service as we were reading research and learning more. And then people lent on us. I used to stand up at conferences and say, this is what you need to do. Now go home and make the materials. It took, people just said to us in the end, can't you just publish them? So that's what we do. And of course, with the modern technology, we've got app versions for these as well. So we do have, but trying to get money to properly evaluate them, we've tried for years. I mean, you need £500,000 in UK money at least to do any sort of randomized controlled trial. Sure. So, we're saying these are the reasons behind the design. These are what research papers you can read. But we can't prove that they work, only to build on what's happened elsewhere. That's probably less true when you get on to teaching vocabulary to language and reading. There's a lot more research. Yeah, still not enough on actually interventions.
And let's, if you don't mind, let's transition to that at this time. As we're talking about language and reading skills, we had Dana Halley on the podcast a while back, and she had shared a little bit about her thought processes behind that. What have you found, or what has the research shown in terms of how best to teach language or reading skills to people with Down syndrome?
Okay, well, let's start off with the language, because it follows on, of course. In the first year of life, children are babbling. In the second year of life, they're beginning to produce words and link words to meaning. So the first thing is building up their vocabulary. And, every new word is drawing their attention to understanding something in their world as well. And so, again, we've got a See and Learn language and reading program because one feeds into the other. And so an early emphasis is all the early words we know children learn. And an awful lot of the research we draw on is US based on typical development and on youngsters with Down syndrome. We also know that when children come to read, the more words they know, the better they're set up for progressing with their reading, and particularly reading comprehension. Okay. And we know for the youngsters with Down syndrome, they're slower to get going with words. But once they, and they do slowly and steadily increase their vocabulary. And there's almost certainly an interactive link here with the speech and speech discrimination problems, which I can't, I could talk to you all day, but there are interactive factors in the rate at which speech allows them to develop new words and so on. They then hit another buffer when it's much more difficult for them to crack the grammar. So they continue to learn vocabulary, and many teenagers are telegraphic. They're stringing nouns, verbs, and adjectives together. You can understand, but the grammar's missing. Now, that's a big problem when you come to read, because it's going to affect your reading comprehension. Now, to just sidestep that, one of the things that my attention was drawn to very early on in all of this work was that youngsters with Down syndrome can remember sight words even when they've hardly got any spoken words. And only yesterday I was discussing with a colleague doing some more research around that. So our introduction to reading is not typical. It doesn't follow exactly what happens for other children. And to sidestep slightly, we now know that some of the speech and language issue is the hearing and auditory processing problems that a typical baby picks up their language from just listening to you. The youngster with Down syndrome is going to find that much more difficult. And we end up with verbal short-term memory issues and so on. So we think the studies that parents alerted me to with their own children, that you've made the word visual, was helping children to hang on to it. So it could be thought of like a sign. To use print early, it's a visual representation of the word. And the youngest children we filmed can learn to read 30 words at 2.5. Now, there's huge individual differences. But for that reason, we start off teaching sight words with 3, 4, and 5-year-olds, where you wouldn't try to begin to teach them to understand phonics and spelling and letter sound stuff, but building up basically just a sight word vocabulary to teach spoken words. So the words we choose are the ones you want in their spoken vocabulary so they can talk to you. So we're using the print as a visual stimulus, but of course we're setting the scene for learning to read. The more sight words, one bit of research in the States, Chris Lemons, who started to look at reading in youngsters with Down syndrome, he showed the very first study he ran teaching phonics at a summer camp, the more words they could already read, the faster they understood phonics.
I see.
So, this is not an either or debate. And because we know that when you get to reading, we're going to have comprehension problems, any child with language delay, verbal short-term memory delay, you can predict reading comprehension problems. They'll read aloud more accurately than they can process it for meaning at the same time. So the other reason I stress a small sight vocabulary in sentences, building little sentences at the child's level and making sure they can read those with understanding. So we've got successful reading with comprehension within what might be quite a small language vocabulary, before we were anywhere near trying to teach them the much more difficult idea that these letters represent sounds.
Right.
And that's really not properly understood. You can only guess a word by sounding it out, like k, a, t is cat. If you already know cat, the word's already got a B in your head. So there's a lot of kind of superficial argument. We do want the children for spelling and for writing, but it's hugely variable. You have children who'll build up sight reading capacities that's really useful to them, but the phonics won't necessarily follow. You'll have a lot of other children now where it does begin to, and we would always teach it in our school system, but we don't. Our youngsters, almost all our little ones with Down syndrome, are fully included in their local schools. So this is a bit different again. to a lot
Yes.
of the experience you have.
Mhm.
And not all, but 85% of the kids start in their local school. Well, and they'll have gone to a preschool at 3 and 4 where everybody's learning about letter sounds. So they do that with everybody else. They can tell you a P is a P sound, but we don't stress. It'll be a while before they could put the P, A, D together and get pad. Yeah. But learning the letter sounds, again, you've got a visual representation for a speech sound, and it may well help their spoken language, but it's taking it slowly and getting teachers and parents to think carefully about what this child actually understands at this point about this process. So we're accused of pushing sight word reading. And ever since we started, we've said, teach them 30 or 40 sight words, make sure they can read those and understand them. And then you'll have a database to start looking at letters in the words they can read. I'd probably say 50 or 60 sight words now. But anyway, you get the picture. We've always gone on to teach them about the alphabet and letter sound links at a pace the individual child can manage. And, you know, I don't have to say to you and this audience, it's hugely variable.
Right, right. And so if I'm summarizing, if I'm understanding correctly, especially in the early reading phase, the sight words are incredibly helpful. And as they progress in their reading skills and their communication skills, they'll then go back to apply phonics concepts and grow their vocabulary that way. Does that seem to be a good summary?
Well, as they learn to apply the letter sounds, that's really relevant for decoding new words and for spelling.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. All of us learn a huge amount of new vocabulary just from reading.
Yeah.
And it's a whole word exercise in the end. Your brain has a huge store of print and you recognize them immediately by their shape. You read as a skilled adult by sight. Anyway, that's another long conversation.
No, it's very,
in terms of learning new words, I think children are learning them from books because of the context, the pictures and everything else they're learning. They don't need to break them into sounds for a new word to get into their vocabulary any more than you and I do.
And I think that this is really, at least from my experience, it's changed the way that we view reading in people with Down syndrome in terms of becoming almost of a skill in a lot of the children that we follow, where especially in those early grade levels, they're reading quite effectively. But one area that I've definitely noticed continues to be a challenge for many people with Down syndrome is math. It's that abstract kind of concept, the idea of 1 + 1 is 2, and what does that really mean? It's how do you and how does the organization kind of talk about teaching math concepts to people with Down syndrome?
Okay, well, we do rather less of that. There are a number of studies saying exactly what you just said. That if you use age-related measures, their reading age is often a couple of years ahead of their math age in these early years. And as you said, you know, we'll have quite a few children whose reading is progressing. I think there are the short-term memory issues, but I also think early numbers are often very badly taught and people don't go slowly enough. And so you have people saying, oh, they can count to 10 or count to 50 when they mean rote counting. And if I say, can that child count 10 objects and then give me 3? No, they can't.
Right.
They haven't done these very early stages where they understand numbers represent quantity.
I see.
And we know quite a lot about that. Again, these very early stages for all children. And again, we have bizarre conversations often with early years teachers who've not had much of an input about number learning and miss some of these things. So I think often the basic, we don't go slowly enough and make sure, you know, they can count objects to 5 and give you 2 out of 5 objects and so on before we start scaling up to 10 and beyond. And we don't do a lot of just teaching rote recognition of written numerals and something. In our schools, too much of that goes on. So I think you're right, but I think with the right sort of teaching, and again, linking it to everyday experiences. So how many plates do you need for the table and your shoes and your buttons and everything else? It's making it real. I think everything for our young people, it needs to relate to something in their lives so they can see why they would be interested in doing it.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting interesting. And I think that that's when you talked about that, counting to 10 and thinking that's teaching number skills, when in actuality it's teaching them how to count count, but not really know what they're counting for. I think that's a really interesting concept. There's so many. When I was on the website, there's so many things on this on the DSEI website that I found. What are some of the resources that are available there from your perspective, and how would a family access those?
Okay. Well, the resources are supposed to fall under two headings that we have started in recent years, developing actual teaching materials. And so we use the See and Learn to stress their visual learners.
Okay.
So we've got a See and Learn speech program, a language and reading program. We've started on a number program, but haven't got beyond the first stage. But that is that stage that's very important.
Yeah.
But aside from that, we did a large randomized controlled trial study of developing language and reading for school-age children. See and Learn was always our baby thing for our early intervention program, though it's trickled up into school now. But we did quite separately, but the same team, we did a research study looking at a language and reading program in school, and that's called RLI, Reading and Language Intervention. It's one of the very few studies with a proper evidence base. Where we ran a randomized control study, and it did cost us £500,000 and the rest. So, and that isn't a set of materials. It's a handbook and how to do it, and examples of what we did in the language teaching module, 20 minutes a day language teaching, 20 minutes a day on literacy, one-to-one, pulled out the classroom, until you can be doing this in the class because they've got going. The other bit then, apart from materials where we've evaluated them, is online training. Mm-hmm. We have recorded a number of online courses since, first of all, we all stopped chasing all over the world, and then COVID struck anyway.
Yes.
But I stopped chasing about because my adult daughter with Down syndrome was ill. So we stopped running around, running conferences, and I sat and turned it all into online training. So parents can, so in other words, our focus is to try and share evidence-based information in a way people can understand it. So we do have a research audience, and we're running a research conference in a few weeks' time. But mostly when we're talking to parents, educators, aides in the classroom, therapists, they want the same sort of information, really. They want the research summarized for them. They haven't got time to go look at it. So really our focus really is making this evidence-based material available. And some 20 years ago, we started producing a whole series of little booklets. We're in the process of setting that up as a website, updating them, but with website access again. Okay. So, yeah. And of course, done as a set of articles on a website, set of linked articles, is so much easier to keep them up to date.
And these materials,
we should be offering that for subscription. We've struggled all the years we've been going to fund staff, to fund anything basically. So I'm afraid we don't provide things for free. There is no way. We've got a significant IT infrastructure and all the rest of it, as you can imagine. And the programming for the apps is done in-house and so on. So to just keep that afloat, you can't. Yeah. Anyway.
Yeah.
So it'll be a subscription site once it's off the ground later in the year.
Okay. And for those See and Learn and the things that are there already, is that also by subscription as well for the families, or how does that work?
Well, at the moment, the materials are purchased. So it's kits or apps, and you just buy the kit you want.
Got it.
Yes. And we run Facebook groups to support people using them.
Okay.
And when people are doing the online courses, they have continuous access to us for advice and support while they're booked into the online courses.
Okay.
I don't see us quite doing See and Learn quite by subscription, but I might be wrong.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I think what I'll do is in the show notes of this podcast, I'll include the link to the website for DSEI. And then I guess, is there any other resources that are out there in terms of anything that we've talked about today that you would recommend highly for our families to take a look at in terms of education in people with Down syndrome?
Okay, well, I have to say I wouldn't be an expert on everything that's available in the US, but of course we have just produced a guide to inclusive education with the National Down Syndrome Society.
Okay.
And again, it's information heavy, if you like, but it has a practical section, you know, because I'm always so keen on telling people the evidence. There's a bit in the middle that describes the research, and but then links it to what you need to do, that you really need to be focusing on speech and language from very early and so on.
Yeah.
So the practical bit is for people in early intervention and preschools, and then your, I want to call them primary schools because that's what we do here, and secondary schools. Yeah, anyway. So yes, that resource is out there and it's freely available off the NDSS website. And it does have lots of links to other resources to include. So that's the place to look, because of course it was done with American colleagues. So they've put the resource links in.
Wonderful. Yeah. And 20% of our podcast listeners are from outside of the US. And so I think that information will be helpful for everyone, really. And I'll include a link to that as well. You said it's on the NDSS website?
Yes.
Okay,
and I can send you a link. And our next step to that is probably to make an international version available that people could adapt. The guidelines we've just done, we did an English version in 2012, which is what we were asked if we could develop. The new version is considerably updated. But if you think the core information about children's development is the same for people, whatever country they're in.
Right, right.
So although their school systems may vary a bit, and we're often asked about permission to translate our material. So we've been talking, in fact, this week about the next steps with NDS with that to make it available for translation, get people's feedback, because I think we all think, you know, I got carried away and it's too long and too detailed. So we're going to get, you know, we'll get some suggestions, I suspect, of doing a more simplified version, etc.
Yes. Oh, that's wonderful. Sue, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today. This was incredibly helpful information for us all. Thank you.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me and for listening.
Yes, and for all the work that you've done and the information that you've been able to share with families really all over the world in terms of how to most appropriately and effectively educate people with Down syndrome. It's been truly amazing life's work that you've been able to do, and I appreciate you sharing some of that with us today. And to our listeners, I hope you enjoyed this podcast as much as I did, and I hope you find the resources that we will be providing in the show notes to be helpful to you as well. If you have any other topics or anything that you would like us to talk about, please do reach out to us at Down Syndrome Center at chp.edu and let me know what topics you'd like us to cover. If you'd like to join us in our mission in this podcast, included in that mission, you can go to www.givetochildrens.org/Down Syndrome Center, and we'd be glad to partner with you in that way as well. But until next time, bye-bye.